Paris, early 1720. A crowd outside the Banque Royale on the Rue Vivienne has grown so dense, so desperate to get inside and trade paper banknotes back for actual gold and silver coin, that people are being crushed against the doors. Several will not survive the crush. Inside, the man responsible for all of it, a convicted murderer who talked his way into becoming the most powerful financial official in France, is watching the one lie he built an entire economy on finally run out of road. His name is John Law, and 6 years earlier, he had walked into France as a fugitive gambler with a death sentence still technically hanging over his head in a different country. Now, he was about to become, depending on which historian you ask, either the man who invented modern paper money or the man who ran the biggest scam in history. Stick around, because both of those descriptions are correct at the same time. If the idea of a convicted killer becoming a nation's central banker sounds like something a screenwriter invented, subscribe now, because John Law is about to prove that reality had this idea a full 300 years before Hollywood could get around to stealing it. John Law was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1671, the son of a goldsmith and banker, meaning he grew up around exactly the kind of financial trade that gave him an early, intimate education in how money, credit, and debt actually functioned behind the scenes. He was also, by every account, unusually gifted at mathematics, a skill he applied almost immediately not to banking, but to gambling, at which he became so successful that contemporaries reportedly nicknamed him Beau Law for his charm and expensive tastes, funded largely by winnings extracted from opponents who assumed card games were about luck rather than probability theory. In 1694, Law's gambling lifestyle collided catastrophically with his temper. He fought a duel in London with a man named Edward Wilson, reportedly over a woman, and killed him. Law was arrested, tried, and convicted of murder, sentenced to death, a fairly serious professional setback for anyone, let alone a man who would go on to run a national economy. He escaped from prison, reportedly by bribing a guard, and fled to the European continent, where he would spend the next 2 decades as a wandering gambler and increasingly serious monetary theorist, developing ideas about paper currency, credit, and national banking that were, for the era, remarkably ahead of their time. It is worth sitting with the fact that the man who would later be handed the keys to France's entire monetary system arrived on the continent as an escaped convicted murderer traveling under the radar. France's system of background checks for senior financial officials, it is fair to say, had room for improvement. By the time Law arrived in France in the early 1700s, the country was in genuinely dire financial condition. Decades of war under Louis XIV, combined with lavish royal spending, had left the French crown with a staggering national debt, much of it owed in short-term obligations at punishing interest rates, not unlike a government running its entire budget on a stack of overdue credit cards. When Louis XIV died in 1715, his successor was a 5-year-old child, and actual power passed to a regent, Philippe, Duke of Orleans, who inherited a treasury so depleted that some of France's own creditors were openly wondering whether the country could function at all. Law, who had been trying for years to convince various European governments to adopt his theories about paper currency and credit expansion, finally found a regent desperate enough to listen. His pitch was seductive in its simplicity. France's problem wasn't a lack of wealth. It was a lack of circulating money, since the country's economy was still largely constrained by the physical supply of gold and silver coin. Replace metal coin with paper banknotes, backed by confidence in a well-run bank rather than by a fixed quantity of buried metal, and you could expand the money supply, stimulate trade, and effectively spend your way out of debt crisis. It was an idea genuinely ahead of its time. It was also an idea that works beautifully right up until the person running it loses the discipline to stop printing, which, as it turns out, is precisely the part John Law struggled with, the bank that actually worked at first. In 1716, the regent granted Law permission to establish the Banque Generale, a private bank authorized to issue paper banknotes. Crucially, and this detail matters enormously for what follows, these early notes were fully convertible into a fixed amount of gold or silver coin on demand, and were initially issued responsibly, backed by real specie reserves. The bank worked. Trade, which had been sluggish under a shortage of circulating coin, picked up. Merchants found paper notes more convenient than hauling sacks of coin around Paris. Confidence grew. Law had, for a brief shining moment, actually delivered exactly what he promised, a functioning paper currency that made the French economy run more smoothly. If the story had ended here, John Law would be remembered today purely as a monetary pioneer. Unfortunately for Law, and considerably more unfortunately for basically everyone who trusted him with their savings, the story kept going. In August 1717, Law expanded his ambitions dramatically, acquiring a trading monopoly over the vast French territory of Louisiana along with French Canada, and founding the Mississippi Company, officially the company D'Occident, to develop and profit from it. On paper, the pitch was extraordinary, a company holding exclusive rights to trade with an enormous, resource-rich American territory, complete with persistent rumors of gold and silver deposits waiting to be discovered along the Mississippi River. In reality, the French colony of Louisiana at the time consisted of a small number of struggling settlements, considerable swampland, and none of the confirmed gold deposits the rumors kept promising. This distinction between the actual muddy, underdeveloped colony and the glittering version described to Parisian investors would turn out to be somewhat important. Law sold shares in the Mississippi Company to the public, and demand, fueled by rumor, celebrity endorsement in the form of Law's own considerable personal fame, and the simple fact that everyone else seemed to be buying, began to climb. Over the following 2 years, Law expanded the company's monopoly further still, absorbing rival trading companies and eventually gaining control over tobacco trading, tax collection, and even the minting of French coinage itself, consolidating an almost absurd share of the French economy under one company run by one increasingly powerful Scotsman. In December 1718, the Regent converted Law's Banque Generale into the Banque Royale, a state institution, with the crown now directly guaranteeing the notes rather than Law's own private capital. This sounds and was marketed as an upgrade in stability. It was, in practice, the moment the safety brakes came off. A privately run bank has to worry about its own solvency. A bank explicitly backed by the full authority of the crown has a considerably easier time simply printing more notes whenever convenient, and convenient, from 1719 onward, became something close to a permanent state. In February 1720, Law merged the Banque Royale and the Mississippi Company entirely, meaning the institution printing France's money and the company selling wildly hyped colonial stock were now, functionally, the same organization run by the same man, with an obvious and enormous incentive to print exactly as many banknotes as needed to keep buying up and propping up the company's own share price. It is roughly equivalent to a modern central bank and a single publicly traded corporation merging into one entity, with a combined organization then printing its own currency specifically to buy its own stock, a plan that tends to work spectacularly well for exactly as long as everyone involved agrees not to look too closely at the math. Share prices of the Mississippi Company rose at a pace that still reads as fiction. In 1719 alone, shares climbed by figures historians estimate at close to 2,000%, turning ordinary Parisians, servants, shopkeepers, minor nobility, into instant paper millionaires virtually overnight. Trading in Mississippi Company shares became so frenzied that it spilled out into the street, specifically onto Rue Quincampoix, a narrow Parisian lane that became so overcrowded with speculators, brokers, and onlookers that the crush of bodies reportedly caused injuries and, on at least one occasion, deaths. This exact frenzy is where the modern word millionaire is widely believed to have entered common usage, coined to describe the previously unimaginable number of ordinary people suddenly, briefly, worth $1,000,000 livres on paper. It is a genuinely remarkable historical footnote that the very word we now use to describe extreme personal wealth was born directly out of watching an entire country enthusiastically buy stock in a company whose core asset was a rumor about gold in a swamp. Law himself, at the peak of his fame, was arguably the most powerful and celebrated man in France who wasn't actually royalty, appointed Controller General of Finances in January 1720, a position that put an escaped convicted murderer from Edinburgh in direct control of the entire French national economy. If there's a single sentence that captures how thoroughly the mania had overridden ordinary caution, it might be that one. As banknote issuance accelerated through 1719 and into 1720, so did prices for ordinary goods across France, in an inflationary spiral that ordinary citizens experienced very directly at the market stall, regardless of how rich their Mississippi Company shares claimed they were on paper. In an increasingly desperate attempt to force the public to keep using paper notes rather than fall back on gold, silver, or jewelry as informal backup currency, the government took the extraordinary step, in March 1720, of banning the wearing of precious stones and restricting the amount of gold and silver coin any individual could hold. Officials were, quite literally, legislating against citizens' instinct to trust something they could hold in their hand over something a government could print an unlimited quantity of, which is possibly the most honest admission of a currency's underlying weakness that any government has ever accidentally put into law. Bubbles, historically, tend to end the same way. Someone with enough insight, or simply enough nerves, decides to convert their winnings into something more solid before everyone else has the same idea. In early 1720, several prominent members of the French nobility, including some royal princes, quietly began converting large blocks of their Mississippi Company shares back into gold and silver, moving their newfound wealth out of France entirely in some cases. Word of this got around, as word of this always does, and other investors, watching people with better information and better connections head for the exits, understandably decided to follow them there. Law attempted increasingly frantic measures to stem the resulting panic, at one point printing an additional 1.5 million livres in fresh banknotes, simply to have enough cash on hand to meet redemption demands, which is a financial equivalent of trying to put out a fire by pouring on more of the exact fuel that started it. It did not work. Confidence, once broken, does not respond well to the very institution that broke it simply promising to try harder. The crash. By mid-1720, the Banque Royale could no longer redeem its own banknotes for actual gold and silver coin, because the quantity of notes in circulation vastly exceeded the metal reserves ever intended to back them. This is, in the most literal sense, the exact moment a paper promise stops being convertible into anything real, and it is precisely the moment the entire system Law had built collapsed. Share prices, which had climbed nearly 2,000% the previous year, now cratered with equivalent speed. The instant paper millionaires of 1719 discovered, over the course of a few brutal months, that a fortune existing only as a number on a company ledger can evaporate considerably faster than it accumulated. Thousands of French investors, from wealthy nobility down to ordinary tradespeople who had sunk their life savings into the mania, were financially ruined. Law was formally dismissed from his position as Comptroller General in May 1720, having spent barely 4 months in a job that made him, briefly, the most powerful financial figure in Europe. Fleeing the country, he'd just financially detonated. By December 1720, with popular fury mounting and his personal safety increasingly in question, John Law fled France, leaving behind a wreckage and economy he had, only 2 years earlier, been credited with rescuing. He spent his remaining years wandering Europe once again, much as he had after his original murder conviction decades earlier, though this time as a disgraced financial architect rather than an ambitious young theorist. He died in Venice in 1729 in considerably reduced financial circumstances for a man who had, at his absolute peak, effectively controlled the money supply of an entire major European power. The gambler who once made his living calculating precise odds at the card table had, in the end, spectacularly misjudged the one gamble that actually mattered, the assumption that a government could print its way out of a debt crisis indefinitely without anyone eventually asking to see the actual gold. The consequences of Law's collapse outlived him by generations. France emerged from the Mississippi bubble with a deep, lasting distrust of paper money, central banking, and financial innovation generally, a wariness so persistent that the country did not establish a proper central bank again until Napoleon founded the Banque de France in 1800, a full 80 years after Law's scheme collapsed. French households, for generations afterward, developed a cultural preference for hoarding physical gold rather than trusting banks or paper instruments, a habit some economic historians trace, at least partly, directly back to the trauma of 1720. Meanwhile, England, which suffered its own related but smaller South Sea bubble in the very same year, went on to develop the Bank of England into one of the most stable and sophisticated financial institutions in the world, a genuinely striking historical divergence between two countries that both got badly burned by speculative mania in 1720 and drew almost opposite lessons from it. Historians still argue, genuinely, about how to categorize John Law. Some economic historians, including the noted scholar Antoine Murphy, have argued Law's underlying monetary theories were legitimate and, in some respects, decades ahead of his time, essentially describing modern fractional reserve banking and monetary policy tools that most governments would not properly adopt for another 2 centuries. Under this reading, Law wasn't a con man so much as a brilliant theorist who lost control of his own experiment once political pressure and public mania overwhelmed his original careful design. Other historians view the entire arc, the rumor-fueled colonial stock, the merger of currency issuance with a single company's share price, the escalating printing to prop up an unsustainable valuation, as something considerably closer to an elaborate, if partly unintentional, fraud, one that happened to be run by the nation's own central bank rather than a lone con artist working a back alley. The honest answer is probably that both readings are true simultaneously. Law appears to have genuinely believed in his system almost until the very end, which does not make the ruin he caused any less real for thousands of ordinary French citizens who lost everything trusting a piece of paper backed, ultimately, by a swamp in Louisiana and a Scotsman's confidence. 3 centuries later, economists still reach the Mississippi bubble as a founding case study whenever a new speculative mania comes along, because the underlying pattern proves remarkably durable. Expand the money supply to support rising asset prices, watch confidence and prices climb together in a self-reinforcing loop, and eventually discover that the loop only ever runs in one direction once it breaks. From the South Sea bubble the very same year, to railway mania a century later, to dot-com stocks and modern speculative bubbles, the specific props change: colonial trading companies, railways, tulip bulbs, technology stocks, cryptocurrency. But the underlying mechanism Law demonstrated first, and most dramatically, has never really gone out of style. He may not have invented human greed. He simply proved, with the full financial backing of an entire nation, exactly how far that greed could be scaled before the gold ran out. If a convicted murderer talking his way into running a country's entire money supply sounds like the kind of thing that could only happen once, you'll want to see the next one. Subscribe, and let us know in the comments which historical scam you want covered next.